2:19 a.m. Al-Assad Air Base, Anbar Province, Western Iraq, 173 kilometers northwest of Baghdad, on the flat, empty desert plateau that stretches from the Euphrates River Valley north to the Syrian border without a significant elevation change for 300 miles. The base occupies the largest military installation footprint in Iraq. A complex of runways, hardened aircraft shelters, fuel storage, headquarters buildings, and barracks that was built by the Iraqi Air Force in the 1980s, expanded by coalition forces after 2003, and has operated continuously as a joint U.S.-Iraqi military facility ever since. At this hour, the temperature is 14 degrees Celsius. Cold for the Iraqi desert, the winter chill coming off the high plateau with a northwest wind at 22 knots. The sky overhead is clear and vast and full of stars. The nearest city is Ramadi, 80 kilometers to the east. On Al-Assad's main apron at 2:19 a.m., 8 F-15E Strike Eagles from the 494th Fighter Squadron, Lakenheath, deployed to Al-Assad on a 6-month rotational tasking in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. 2 KC-135R Stratotankers on the tanker ramp. A pair of MQ-9 Reapers in their hardened storage hangars. And in the Combined Air Operations Center at the base's eastern perimeter, a hardened structure that had been the coalition's Western Iraq air coordination node for 15 years. The Night Watch team, managing the Anbar Province air picture in coordination with the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve at Baghdad and with CENTCOM at Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar. There are 943 American military personnel at Al-Assad on this night. Marines attached to the Advise and Assist mission with the Iraqi Army's 7th Division at the adjacent base sector. Air Force personnel from the 332nd Air Expeditionary Wing managing the F-15E and tanker operations. Special Operations Forces operating from a compound on the base's northern perimeter. And throughout the sprawling facility, Iraqi Air Force personnel and their families living in the base housing areas that occupy the southwestern corner of the installation. The Islamic Republic of Iran had struck Al-Assad once before, on January 8, 2020, when the IRGC launched 16 Hyam ballistic missiles at the base in retaliation for the elimination of IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani. That strike, the largest direct Iranian military attack on a U.S. facility, had caused traumatic brain injuries among American personnel, but 0 fatalities, primarily because intelligence warning had allowed evacuation of vulnerable areas before impact. The IRGC's leadership had assessed that strike as a demonstrated capability that had been constrained by political decision from causing maximum damage. 4 years later, the IRGC Aerospace Forces Al-Assad planning team had a different objective and a different weapon package. One designed to cause maximum operational disruption to the base's aviation capability without the political calculation constraints that had shaped the 2020 strike. The weapon package, 20 Soumar long-range land attack cruise missiles, the Iranian adaptation of the Soviet Kh-55, turbofan-powered, terrain following at 50 meters altitude, GPS and inertial navigation, range assessed at 2,000 kilometers, warhead of 450 kilograms. The Soumar's key characteristic for this mission was its range. Launched from 4 mobile launcher vehicles at positions in Iran's Kermanshah province, just west of the Zagros Mountains near the Iraqi border, the Soumar could cover the 300 kilometers to Al-Assad in approximately 22 minutes, while terrain following at low altitude through the Euphrates Valley corridor, approaching the base from the northeast along a flight path that minimized its exposure to the Saudi-operated air defense radar network covering the Iraqi desert from bases in Saudi Arabia to the south. 20 Soumar missiles, 5 per launcher vehicle, targeting the F-15E apron, the KC-135 tanker ramp, the Combined Air Operations Center, the fuel storage complex on the base's western perimeter, and the MQ-9 hangar complex. Alongside the Soumar package, 36 Shahed 238 jet-powered loitering munitions from 2 launch positions in Al-Qaim district along the Iraqi-Syrian border. Positions that had been occupied by IRGC-backed Popular Mobilization Force units for 4 years, and that the IRGC had used to stage weapons and personnel in Iraqi territory without official Iraqi government authorization. The Shahed 238 vehicles at these positions had been moved to their launch sites under cover of PMF logistics activity 3 days earlier. Their presence concealed from Iraqi Air Force surveillance by the PMF's operational security practices inside the territory they controlled. 36 Shahed 238S from inside Iraq, 20 Soumar from Iranian territory, 56 weapons total approaching Al-Assad from 2 different directions. The Soumar from the northeast through the Euphrates Valley, the Shahed 238 formation from the west-northwest across the Syrian desert plain. The dual-axis design was intended to force Al-Assad's defensive architecture to simultaneously manage threats from 2 opposite compass quadrants, dividing the limited engagement coverage of the base's own defensive batteries. They made 6 catastrophic mistakes. The first mistake, the PMF staging area surveillance. The movement of 36 Shahed 238 vehicles to launch positions in Al-Qaim district over 3 days had not been invisible. The MQ-9 Reaper, unmanned aircraft assigned to persistent surveillance of the Al-Qaim border district, a tasking maintained by CJTFO-IR specifically because of the documented IRGC use of PMF-controlled territory for weapons staging, had imaged the Shahed 238 vehicles on 2 separate passes in the 36 hours before the attack. The first imaging pass, at 2:47 p.m. the day before, had shown 12 elongated vehicle shapes under camouflage netting at a PMF compound north of Al-Qaim. The second pass, at 11:09 p.m. on the night of the attack, had shown all 36 vehicles positioned at dispersed launch points in open desert outside the compound, a configuration consistent with pre-launch positioning. CJTFOIR's intelligence staff had transmitted a launch imminent assessment to Al-Assad and to CENTCOM at 11:19 p.m., 3 hours before the Shahed 238 attack initiated. 3 hours. Al-Assad had been at elevated threat posture since 11:25 p.m. The second mistake, the Soumar engine pre-ignition signature. The Soumar cruise missiles' turbofan engines required a pre-ignition sequence, a fuel purge and engine warm cycle that ran for between 8 and 12 minutes before the missile's launch computer was satisfied with the engine's readiness for the sustained flight required to reach Al-Assad from Kermanshah province. During those 8 to 12 minutes, the Soumar's turbofan produced a small but measurable thermal emission from the missile's inlet and exhaust that the RC-135V/W rivet joint, operating at standard Iraq-Iran border collection orbit from Al-Udeid, could detect at close range with its passive infrared collection system. The rivet joint detected thermal signatures consistent with 20 Soumar turbofan pre-ignition sequences beginning at 2:07 a.m., 12 minutes before launch. It transmitted a launch imminent assessment to Al-Assad at 2:09 a.m., The base had been warned of the Soumar threat at 2:09 a.m., 10 minutes before the first missile launched and 31 minutes before any Soumar could reach the base perimeter. Combined with the 11-hour Shahed 238 warning from the previous evening, Al-Assad had the most comprehensive pre-attack warning of any engagement in this theater. The third mistake: the Euphrates Valley Approach Corridor. The Soumar's terrain-following route from Kermanshah province to Al-Assad followed the Euphrates River Valley Corridor, the geographic low point of the Iraqi desert that provided the most reliable terrain-following path for a 50-meter altitude cruise missile transiting 300 kilometers of flat to moderately rolling terrain. The Euphrates Valley Corridor was not a secret approach route. It was the most predictable low-altitude approach axis to Al-Assad from the northeast, and CJTFOIR's air defense planners had incorporated it into the base's threat assessment for 7 years. The 3 AN/MPQ-64 Sentinel radar systems positioned on Al-Assad's northeastern perimeter, oriented specifically toward the Euphrates Valley corridor, had been in active air search mode since the RC-135V/W's launch imminent warning at 2:09 a.m. The first Soumar missiles would not arrive at the Sentinel's detection range without being fully tracked and with engagement solutions already developed. The fourth mistake: the Shahed 238 approach axis crossing. The 36 Shahed 238 vehicles approaching from the west-northwest across the Syrian desert plain had to cross a broad band of open desert between the Syrian border and Al-Assad before reaching terminal approach range. In the 3 hours since the MQ-9's pre-launch warning, the CJTFOIR Air Coordination Cell at Al-Assad had repositioned 2 of the base's 4 Avenger Stinger air defense vehicles to the western perimeter, the bearing from which the Shahed 238 formation was approaching, and had retasked the base's single CRAM Centurion system from its standard apron coverage position to an elevated berth on the western maintenance building's rooftop that gave it line-of-sight coverage extending 8 kilometers west of the perimeter fence. The Shahed 238 approach axis that was designed to be the dual-axis attack's quiet approach, the side opposite the Soumar threat from the northeast, had been covered, reinforced, and given 3 hours to prepare. The fifth mistake: the Shahed gap assessment. The IRGC Aerospace Force's targeting model for Al-Assad had assessed the base's short-range air defense as consisting of 1 CRAM Centurion system and 2 Avenger Stinger vehicles, the declared inventory of the base's organic air defense element, as of a published U.S. Army source from 18 months earlier. What the model had not accounted for was the deployment of 2 additional Shahed systems to Al-Assad 7 weeks before this engagement: a second CRAM Centurion and a Coyote UAS Counter-UAS interceptor system, both deployed as part of CENTCOM's Al-Assad hardening initiative following intelligence assessments of elevated IRGC strike planning activity against Iraqi-based U.S. facilities. The actual Shahed inventory was twice what the IRGC's model credited. The defensive gap the attack was designed to exploit did not exist. The sixth mistake was the most consequential and the most fundamental: the assumption that attacking Al-Assad with cruise missiles and drones, a facility that had survived the 2020 Qiyam ballistic missile strike and had been continuously hardened in the 4 years since, would achieve operational disruption proportionate to the number of weapons employed. Al-Assad in 2024 was not Al-Assad in 2020. The 2020 strike had driven a comprehensive hardening program. F-15E shelters reinforced with overhead protection rated to withstand a direct hit from a 450-kilogram warhead. The CAOC's electronic systems duplicated and distributed into 3 separate hardened nodes that could each operate independently if the others were struck. The fuel storage complex surrounded by blast deflection berms, the MQ-9 hangars embedded in reinforced concrete structures. Even if the IRGC's weapons had reached their target coordinates, the damage they could inflict on a facility hardened to these standards was a fraction of what the IRGC's operational objectives required. At 2:19 a.m. and 14 seconds, the first Soumar's turbofan clears the Zagros mountain ridgeline at 50 meters altitude and enters the Euphrates Valley terrain, following segment of its 300-kilometer approach. Al-Assad's Sentinel radar acquires the first 6 Soumar cruise missiles entering its search volume at 41 kilometers at 2:23 a.m. By 2:25 a.m., all 20 Soumar tracks are confirmed and transmitted to the Al-Assad Shahed Coordination Network. At the Al-Assad Shahed Fire Direction Center, the duty controller executes the prepared engagement plan. The Patriot PAC-3 battery, detached from the 143rd Air Defense Artillery Battalion, a 4-launcher station configuration positioned on Al-Assad's northeastern perimeter, specifically for cruise missile defense, fires its first engagement sequence at 2:26 a.m. as the leading Soumar missiles reach PAC-3 MSE engagement range at 40 kilometers northeast of the base. 12 PAC-3 MSE interceptors fire in a 16-second sequence, 2 per highest priority track against 6 leading Soumar missiles, 1 per track against the remaining 14, with ESSM backup assigned on the 6 highest concern tracks. The PAC-3 MSE's active seeker acquires each Soumar's turbofan return at 15 kilometers and guides to proximity detonation. The Soumar is a large, slow-moving target for the PAC-3 MSE. Its turbofan engine produces a substantial radar cross-section and a significant infrared signature that the PAC-3 seeker acquires with no ambiguity. 10 intercepts on the first PAC-3 salvo at ranges between 28 and 38 kilometers northeast of the base perimeter. 10 Soumar survivors continue inbound. PAC-3 fires 8 additional MSE interceptors, 1 per remaining highest priority track, with 2 assigned to the 3 Soumar missiles whose approach geometry gives them the best probability of reaching the apron, or CAOC. 7 intercepts between 20 and 26 kilometers. 3 Soumar missiles survive both PAC-3 engagement salvos and close to within 18 kilometers of the base perimeter, their turbofan exhaust signatures burning bright on the Sentinel radar display. The ESSM Block 2 launcher, a shore-based Mark 56 VLS installation commissioned for Al-Assad's defense 18 months earlier. Its 8 ready cells loaded for this exact contingency. Fires 6 ESSM Block 2 missiles at 2:29 a.m. against the 3 Soumar survivors. 2 intercepts at 12 and 9 kilometers. 1 Soumar, the last surviving missile of the 20-missile salvo, targeting the F-15E apron on the base's eastern end, passes through the ESSM engagement zone with its guidance intact, closing to within 6 kilometers of the apron at 2:31 a.m. The base's forward C-RAM Centurion, positioned on the northeastern apron hardstand, acquires the Soumar at 4,200 meters and fires a 3-second burst of 20mm tungsten at 4,500 rounds per minute. The Soumar's turbofan section is penetrated at 3,000 meters. It loses propulsion. It descends from 50 meters altitude and impacts the desert floor at 1.8 kilometers from the F-15 E-apron fence line. Its 450-kilogram warhead detonates on impact. The blast crater is 8 meters across. No aircraft. No fuel storage. No personnel. Open desert between the perimeter fence and the apron security barrier. The detonation is audible across the base. No structural damage to any facility. 20 Soumar land attack cruise missiles. 10 intercepted by PAC-3 MSE in the first engagement salvo. 7 intercepted by PAC-3 MSE in the second salvo. 2 intercepted by ESSM Block 2. 1 warhead detonated in open desert 1.8 kilometers from the F-15E apron. 0 structural damage to any Al-Assad facility. The 36 Shahed 238 formation approaches from the west-northwest simultaneously with the Soumar engagement sequence. The CRAM Centurion on the Western Maintenance Building rooftop acquires the leading edge of the Shahed 238 formation at 4,300 meters at 2:28 a.m. and begins its sustained engagement sequence, 3-second bursts at maximum tracking rate against the leading vehicles crossing the perimeter approach bearing. The CRAM's 20mm tungsten engagement rate is 6,000 rounds per minute. Against Shahed, 238 vehicles at 50 to 90 meters altitude approaching at 350 kilometers per hour, each 3-second burst fires 300 rounds through the vehicle's projected flight path. First 7 Shahed 238 vehicles neutralized in 91 seconds as they cross the 4,000-meter engagement threshold. The 2 Avenger Stinger vehicles on the western perimeter, repositioned 3 hours earlier from their standard apron positions, each fire 2 FYM-92K Stinger missiles at the next 8 Shahed 238 vehicles, crossing the 5-kilometer engagement zone. 14 Stinger missiles against 8 targets. 7 intercepts. 1 Shahed 238 survives the Stinger engagement on the western perimeter axis and closes to within 2.8 kilometers of the base fence. The rooftop CRAM re-engages at 2,800 meters, 1.5-second burst. The Shahed 238 is rendered inoperable at 2,100 meters and impacts the desert floor 140 meters outside the base perimeter fence. Its 40-kilogram warhead detonates. A small crater. The perimeter fence is undamaged. The Coyote Counter-UAS interceptor system, the second defensive element the IRGC's model had not credited, engages the remaining 21 Shahed 238 vehicles crossing the 5 to 8 kilometer approach band from the west. The Coyote Block 3 Interceptor, an expendable autonomous air vehicle with a collision intercept guidance system and a fragmentation payload, is specifically designed for the velocity and flight profile of exactly this class of threat. The Coyote system fires 21 interceptors against 21 targets in a 48-second automated sequence. 17 intercepts between 4 and 7 kilometers from the base perimeter. 4 Shahed 238 survivors enter the base's airspace, crossing the western perimeter fence. The second CRAM Centurion, positioned on the apron hardstand facing west, engages all 4 perimeter crossing Shahed 238 vehicles at ranges between 1,900 and 2,600 meters. 4 separate 1-second bursts. 3 Shahed 238 vehicles rendered inoperable within the perimeter airspace, their fragments falling on the western maintenance compound's paved surfaces. 1 Shahed 238 survives the second CRAM's burst, its guidance section partially damaged, It veers 14 degrees north of its programmed aim point and impacts the roof of an unoccupied equipment storage building at the base's northwestern corner. Its 40-kilogram warhead detonates. The storage building's roof collapses into the structure. No personnel inside. The building had been evacuated as part of the base-wide shelter order issued at 11:25 p.m. No casualties. 2:34 a.m. 15 minutes since the first Soumar crossed the Zagros ridgeline. 36 Shahed 238 vehicles engaged from two directions since 2:28 a.m. 20 Soumar cruise missiles, 10 by PAC-3 MSE first salvo, 7 by PAC-3 MSE second salvo, 2 by ESSM Block 2, 1 warhead detonated in open desert, 0 structural damage to any facility. 36 Shahed 238 loitering munitions, 7 by CRAM first sequence, 7 by Avenger Stinger, 17 by Coyote Counter-UAS, 3 by CRAM second sequence, 1 impacted unoccupied storage building roof, 1 Soumar warhead in open desert, 1 Shahed in an empty building, 2 detonations on base property, 0 casualties, 0 aircraft damaged, 0 fuel storage affected, CAOC operational without interruption throughout. The base commander transmits his post-engagement report to CJTFO, IR, and CENTCOM at 2:36 a.m. CENTCOM, Al-Assad. All 56 threat tracks engaged and neutralized. 1 Soumar warhead in open desert 1.8 kilometers from apron. No damage. 1 Shahed in unoccupied storage building. No casualties. All aircraft, fuel, and command facilities intact. 0 personnel casualties. Requesting authorization for ANBAR response. Time-sensitive targets and window. CENTCOM authorization arrives at 2:38 a.m. At 2:39 a.m., 4 F-15E Strike Eagles taxi from their hardened shelters to the runway threshold, aircraft that had been configured for strike missions with GBU, 31 JDAM and AGM-65 Maverick since the Shahed warning at 11:25 p.m. Their crews at cockpit ready alert since 2:12 a.m. They launch in pairs at 2:41 a.m. and 2:43 a.m., climbing northeast toward the Iraqi-Iranian border. Their targets? The 4 Soumar mobile launcher vehicles whose post-launch dispersal from the Kermanshah province positions had been tracked continuously by the RC-135V/W and a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft from Al-Assad Air Base that had been tasked to the Kermanshah province orbit since 11:30 p.m. The U-2's ASARS-2 synthetic aperture radar had updated the 4 TEL vehicle positions at 2:33 a.m., 2 minutes before the F-15E crews received their targeting data. At 2:49 a.m., 2 MQ-9 Reapers from Al-Assad's own hangar launched at 2:27 a.m. during the Soumar engagement sequence under operator authority, fire AGM-114R Hellfire missiles against the Shahed 238 Al-Qaim PMF launch positions, 8 Hellfire missiles against the vehicle staging area and the command post whose communications the RC-135V/W had logged as the coordination node for the Western Axis attack. The staging area and command post struck between 2:51 a.m. and 2:54 a.m. The 4 F-15E Strike Eagles delivered 12 GBU-31 JDAM against the 4 Soumar TEL vehicle dispersal positions between 3:09 a.m. and 3:17 a.m. All 4 vehicles struck. Secondary detonations at 2 positions confirm stored propellant or additional Soumar components. The remaining 8 F-15E on the Al-Assad apron are taxied to runway readiness for follow-on strike packages as CENTCOM's broader ANBAR response targeting list is transmitted to the wing's weapons officer. By 3:21 a.m., 62 minutes after the first Soumar launched from Kermanshah, all immediate response packages are complete. Battle damage assessment, CJT, FOIR, and CENTCOM intelligence at 6 a.m. Al-Assad Air Base. One Soumar warhead detonated in open desert 1.8 kilometers from apron. No structural damage. One Shahed impacted empty storage building. Roof collapse, no personnel affected. All F-15E, KC-135, and MQ-9 aircraft undamaged. CAOC and all command nodes operational without interruption. Fuel storage undamaged. 0 American personnel casualties. 0 Iraqi personnel casualties. 4 Soumar mobile launcher vehicles in Kermanshah province, all struck by F-15 EGBU-31, secondary detonations at 2 vehicles. Shahed 238 Al-Qam PMF staging area and command post, struck by MQ-9 Hellfire, estimated IRGC and PMF personnel. Casualties 29 to 44. At 3:28 a.m., Al-Assad transitions from base defense condition alpha to heightened security. The F-15E shelters cycle through their post-alert checks, and the aircraft are inspected for any blast or fragmentation effects from the nearby detonations. None found. The KC-135s are pre-flighted for the day's scheduled tanker missions. The CAOC morning watch team relieves the night watch at 4 a.m. on schedule. The runways are inspected by the airfield manager's team and declared fully operational at 4:11 a.m. Al-Assad Air Base had stood in Anbar province for 40 years under multiple flags and through multiple conflicts. It survived the 2020 ballistic missile strike. It survived tonight's combined cruise missile and drone strike. The facility that Iran's IRGC aerospace force had targeted with 56 precision weapons across 2 simultaneous attack axes finished the engagement with 2 small detonations on its property, one in open desert, one in an empty building, and all 943 American personnel at their posts accounted for and unharmed. The F-15E Strike Eagles that were on the apron when the first Soumar launched are back in their shelters, fully armed and ready for the morning's tasking. The tankers are pre-flighted. The CAOC is running. Western Iraq's air picture is managed without a gap. The platform that Iran intended to disrupt operates without interruption. The aircraft that were supposed to be cratered on the apron are preparing for their morning missions. The base is open.